Okay, we are engaged in a study of 1 Corinthians. We're glad that you have joined us. We have titled this, Saints Under Construction. Because if you know anything about the first century saints in Corinth, you know that there was plenty of room to grow. Our basic verse for the entire quarter is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where in verse 10 Paul says, "According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation." And we can read historically about that in the book of Acts. "And someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Jesus was the foundation in Corinth. Paul had come proclaiming Jesus. The result was Christians, the multitude of those Christians formed the church in Corinth. He was there with them for a time. Now he was away. There has been some correspondence, and he is writing what you and I refer to as 1 Corinthians. And he's encouraging these saints in Corinth to be careful how they build upon the perfect foundation of Jesus Christ. We've broken this down. We're approaching it week by week in topical chunks. We're following the flow of the text, but we're breaking it down into its individual themes. And so in week 1, we established, as we build from chapters 1 through 3, there must be no divisions among us. As we build, chapter 4, we must not go beyond what is written. Chapter 5, as we build, the church must be kept pure. Chapter 6, the first half of it, we must learn to get along. Second half, week 5, as we build, we must use our bodies to glorify God. 2 weeks ago in chapter 7, as we build, we must lead lives that the Lord has assigned. And then last week, as we build, we must guard against pride. You look with me at chapter 8 and verse 13. It's kind of a conclusive statement of what we have as chapter 8. Paul says, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble." And we talked a little bit about the cultural, historical significance about what was going on there. Earlier in the chapter, as to eating of food offered to idols, we know, Paul says, an idol has no real existence and there is no God but one. We know that. And there has been some correspondence between these saints and Paul about that. And yet, despite what we know, here's the problem. We know these things intellectually, but this knowledge puffs up. And as a result, it destroys love. Now, we're taking the time to refresh ourselves what we talked about last week, because even though you and I have a big number 9 at the beginning of this chapter and a little verse 1, and we go on from there, of course, Paul didn't do that. This is just continuing really the conclusive statement in what we have as chapter 8 and verse 13. He's going to show us in what we have as chapter 9 what that looks like personally in his own life. And then in chapter 10, we're going to come back to this whole idea. And so this foundation is very, very, very important, because we're going to continue to come back to it over and over and over again. These saints in Corinth think they know certain things. But there is more to following Jesus and being a faithful child of God than just having certain accurate facts in my head. This knowledge is the result of getting and not giving. It's a possession, something we've attained, and so we're prone to boast about it. Love, on the other hand, is not about me. It builds up. It's the act of giving, not getting. It's not an attainment or an acquisition. It moves outward. It shares. It takes thought of others. At the root of all of this, one of the basic problems in Corinth is you think you know, and as a result of what you think you know, it's as if you think you have arrived, but you don't really know yet as you ought to know. Therefore, Paul's going to argue, you don't really know what you ought to know at all. Now that's a handful, and we talked our way through it last week, but we ended on this idea, the role of loving in our knowing. And a simple way to establish this is, the end, our goal, our aim is not simply to know. The end, the goal of all of it, the great and first commandment is, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and you love who as yourself? Your neighbor, right? And if I have all of these accurate facts in my head, but it's not leading me down the superior pathway of love, what good is all of that knowledge going to do? Really not all that much at all. And he's going to return to this over and over and over again. You think about what we have in chapter 13. Faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of all of these is what? Is love, right? I mean, he begins a thread in chapter 8 that's really going to resonate all throughout nearly the rest of this book. Any knowledge that does not stand in the service of love is not real knowing the way God would have us to know. Knowing and thinking exist for the sake of love, for the sake not only of exalting God, but of building up other people in faith. Thinking and knowing are given to us by God for the purpose of loving God and loving people. And deeper than knowing facts about God and idols is, in the language of verse 3, being known by God. Okay? That was our foundation as we kind of launch into a lengthy section here. We said chapter 13, we've got the word, or verse 13, we've got the word therefore. For the first 12 verses, he has been building and building and building to this point. Therefore, verse 13, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. And as Paul so often does, he'll make an argument that kind of blows our minds a little because it's deep and it's wordy and there's a lot there. And then he's going to give us a lengthy illustration of that, and then he's going to return to the argument. It's all over the writings of Paul. Okay, so chapter 8, verses 1 through 12, here's the argument. You don't really know as you ought to know. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat. Now in chapter 9, he's going to give himself as a personal example. Okay, and he starts out, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. When Paul refers to himself as an apostle, what does he have in mind? Dave?
Well, apostle just simply means one sent. He was an apostle to the Gentiles. That's what the Lord had set out as his purpose. And so he was sent to the Gentiles to preach and to teach and convert them.
Yeah. It's a generic word, right? It doesn't necessarily have to have a religious context. It just means someone who is sent. And at times it's used in the New Testament to refer simply to someone who was sent, someone who was commissioned and supported by a church to go to a particular area and to proclaim the gospel. But when Paul, especially when he argues in this kind of language, when he describes himself as an apostle, he's trying to draw attention to something very, very specific. The idea that he has been sent by whom?
Jesus.
By Christ, by God, right? We could go back in our Bibles to Acts 9 where he has this dialogue with the risen Lord, right? And as Dave has brought out, he is specifically commissioned to go to the Gentiles. There are other apostles whose ministry really centers around the area of Jerusalem and Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, that little stretch of land that we refer to as Israel. But Paul travels far and wide, right? It is he who has gone all the way to Corinth in Greece. And now he's writing back to them. And at the base of this first paragraph in chapter 9 is the idea of authority, right? I know what I'm talking about is one of the things that Paul is trying to develop. And over again he asserts, what I'm writing I didn't come up with. These are words that I received from the Lord. He's going to talk about that again in chapter 11 in connection with the Lord's Supper. If anyone has the right to assert their own will or their own authority, it would be a Christ-commissioned apostle, right? But one of the things that he is... We've got that cut off there. I forgot to complete that. But one of the things that he is going to really assert in what we have as chapter 8 is, as we build, we must guard, or as we build, we must not put a stumbling block in the way of the gospel. And so he's going to use himself here, first of all, as an example. In verse 3, this is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Okay, we think back to the argument that began in chapter 8. We've got the right to do that. Why? Well, we know that an idol has no real existence, and we know that there is no God but one. We know that whether we eat or we do not, food does not commend us to God. It's the same foundation that he's going to develop as far as circumcision is concerned. Whether you undergo that or not is not going to commend you to God. That served a purpose, but it has come and gone. And so the first question in verse 4 relates back to chapter 8. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord? And Cephas, who's one of those brothers of the Lord who is going to write a New Testament epistle. James, right? Among others, okay? Who did not believe until they had seen the resurrected Lord, very much like Saul of Tarsus. When he refers to Cephas, who's he referring to? Peter, right? Cephas and Peter, same person. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Now, what in the world does he have in mind there? Does he expect them to support him while he just sits around and does nothing? No, Paul has already at times and will continue to talk about the necessity of working, right? And if anyone will not work, he shall not eat. And so we follow his train of thought here, and then we're going to see what exactly he has in mind. Is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? What's he have in mind there? You got the idea of working for something, working on something, and then reaping some of the harvest benefits from it. Alan, go ahead.
Well, he has, at the beginning of the chapter, I am free from a sin, and therefore I am not an apostle. They was having trouble at this period of time because he was not picked by Christ, but he chosen how to do season. So he's trying to relate that the apostle picked by Jesus have this right, and don't do I have this right, and Barnabas was not picked by Jesus.
Okay. You know, there were certain men, obviously, who had walked with Jesus and interacted with Jesus for 3 years. Saul of Tarsus didn't do that. The Lord did appear to him, of course, later on, and so he's going to refer to himself as an apostle born out of due time or due season, something like that, where he wasn't like Peter or James or John. He's going to assert that he's on the same level as them. We know that, and we'll talk about that later on. In this particular context, as he's asking these questions, what's he getting at? What right does he have that he's alluding to?
He has the right to turn. He's living and preaching the gospel. He decided to be an example for them, work with them.
Yeah. This is all about, I have the right to do this, but for the sake of the gospel, I'm going to abstain or hold off or wait on certain things. And he's continually drawing attention to the gospel. Okay, we're going to see that. In this particular instance, the first question relates back to chapter 8. Don't we have the right to eat and drink? Yes, we do. But we're not going to take advantage of that right. Why? Because of the higher walk of love in light of the present context of what's going on. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife like these other men do? We do. But there are circumstances here. We think back to when Paul first comes across Timothy. Timothy is a great, devout, reverential young man who knows a lot. Paul sees a lot of potential in him. But before Paul takes him anywhere where Jews are going to be, what does he make sure is done to Timothy? You remember? He's circumcised, right? Why? Because in order to be right with God, Timothy had to be circumcised? In order to be a preacher of the gospel, did Timothy have to be circumcised? So why did he do it?
They accepted him.
Okay? To avoid putting a stumbling block in the way of the gospel. That's what this is all about. Okay? Last week in the context of chapter 8, we said over and over and over again, it's not about me, it's all about God. In chapter 9, we could say, it's not about me, it's all about the gospel. Paul has every right to receive monetary support from these people and from others. And he's going to develop later on. He has received support from saints in Thessalonica more than once, and he very, very, very much appreciates that. But if there are saints in Corinth who even doubt his apostleship, and then he comes and he reasons that you need to support me, we've got the potential for a stumbling block right there. And so he's building a case, drawing attention first and foremost to the gospel and the way of love, and he's using himself as an example. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, Jason, I think it's important. He devotes a section here in his second letter, in chapter 11, to this whole issue that some had doubted his apostleship.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, he's getting at it. I mean, in chapter 11, or 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he says, I robbed other churches to serve you.
Yeah.
And he didn't take a dime from the church at Corinth. But he received support from other churches, and there was this question about of some there that questioned his apostleship and whether he was really an apostle.
And from the standpoint of human nature, if there is very fertile ground, let's say in Thessalonica, and let's say he's got a great working relationship with that church, there's a lot of mutual admiration, and then you come to Corinth, and on top of all of these problems that we've already documented and more to come, many more to come, and then on top of all of that, you've got these people who are being very careless, very self-centered, as they build on the groundwork that he has laid, and you've got them even doubting that he's got any religious authority whatsoever. Human nature would say, do what in relation to the saints in Corinth? Forget about them, right? Just let them soak in all of their problems that they just can't seem to grow out of. And I'm going to go and I'm going to work more wholeheartedly and give more diligent attention to, for instance, those saints in Thessalonica or any other city. But Paul is modeling for us, these people mean a great deal to him, right? And he is not at the center of his own affections. That's Christ. And he does it all. He's going to say more than once in this chapter before we're done, I'm doing it all for the sake of the gospel. And there are saints in Corinth who desperately need further grounding in the gospel, and there are lost people who desperately need the gospel. And so rather than assert his personal right that he has every right to assert and enjoy for the sake of the gospel, he's going to put himself out. He's going to make it more inconvenient for himself for the sake of the gospel and for the good of these people. That's what this is all about. In verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? And when he's referring to that, of course, he's referring to the law of Moses. For it is written in the law of Moses, citing from what we have as Deuteronomy 25, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Here you've got a simple picture. An ox is working out in the grain, and if you muzzled the ox, what does that mean? Yeah, put something on him where he can't eat. And so he's doing all of this work in the middle of these grain fields, and you're going to keep him from eating what little of that produce that he's could eat as he's doing the work. It's not hard to imagine, a really greedy landowner. I'm going to soak every bit of grain out of this that I possibly can, and I'm going to work these oxen to death, and I'm not going to allow them to eat while they're working. God said, don't do that. Okay? And Paul is going to latch on to that in verse 10. Does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was written for our sake because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? There are more than one who have the right to be supported in the work of the gospel by saints here in Corinth and beyond. Nevertheless, another conclusive kind of word. Here's our argument, and here are the foundational points. Now, nevertheless, this is what I'm getting at. We have not made use of this right. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Now, what at the base, at the foundation, at his core, what motivates Paul to do that? I could do this, and life would be easier if I did this. But for the sake of the gospel, I'm not going to do that. How do you get to that point? Cheryl?
Putting Christ first in your life.
That's the only way that happens, right? It is if it's all about him. My allegiance belongs squarely with him. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. I am a slave of Christ, Paul says on more than one occasion, and encourages all Christians to be sold out slaves of Christ. And if I do that, if Jesus is at the pinnacle, the foundation of it all, and everything is all about him, then the gospel is going to take prominence over everything, right? And then he tells me to esteem other people as more important than myself. And that's how I get to this point. If Paul doesn't believe in the resurrected Christ, he doesn't do things like this, does he? But he has been so captured by this vision, so grateful for the amazing grace that has been shown to him, so hopeful for the inheritance in heaven. I can put up with this for the sake of the gospel. Verse 13, he returns to the argument. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? They could understand that in the Corinthian context, right? We talked about that in chapter 8, that there were temple priests in Corinth of these pagan idols. Verse 14, in the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. Paul talks in his letters about the reasons that he has to boast. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He would rather have unbelievers in Corinth come to faith in the gospel without any sort of a stumbling block from him than take advantage of his own personal right. He would rather have saints in Corinth take what he says as God-breathed than to assert his right to get monetary support from them and say, well, he's just interested in money, we're not going to listen to him. He does it all for the sake of the gospel. Alan, go ahead.
In Ephesians, 1 Thessalonians 2:3 says, for our appeal does not spring from error or impurity, or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts.
That was at the center of it all, right? You look at verse 19 here very quickly. Though I am free from all. Paul knows who his judge is, right? And it's not saints in Corinth. I have made myself a servant to all. Why? That I might win more. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. You think about what we said in connection with Timothy and circumcision. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. He's under authority. There are expectations of him, but he did that he might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Is Paul a hypocrite? Is he two-faced? What do we make of that paragraph? Dave?
He's consistent with his approach of sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
And becoming a Jew or like a Gentile is not forbidden by the law, and he's not. He's doing it with the genuine interest of sharing the gospel. Yeah. That's it.
He's going to meet people where they are, right? If they're Jews, he's going to use Jewish lines of argument and appeal to Jesus as the Messiah. If it's Gentiles, he's not going to expect them to go back and learn all of the ins and the outs of the Old Testament law. He's going to reason from the standpoint of a Gentile and proclaim the unknown God, like he did in Athens, right? This is all about the gospel and bringing people wherever they are in life to faith in the gospel. Verse 24, finally, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run, that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. If I have to humble myself, if I have to go without, if I have to inconvenience myself so that someone else has a clear path to the gospel without any sort of stumbling block from me, I'm willing to do that. Chapter 8 is not about me. It is all about God and other people. Chapter 9 is not about me. It is all about the gospel. And I would draw your attention here as we close to the end of that last verse. Paul takes seriously the idea of being disqualified, right? Paul does not believe once you're saved, you're always saved, as is so common in today's religious climate. He takes seriously faithfulness to God, faithfulness to the calling. This is just one of an easy dozen examples that we could draw out that, yes, being born again is a wonderful thing, and it takes care of all of the sins of the past, but that's the beginning, right? I mean, to use this analogy, that gets me in the race, and now there is a race to be run. There is a life that exalts Christ to be lived, and he's going to take that seriously, putting God first and others ahead of himself. Okay? Thank you very much for being here. Lord willing, we will be in chapter 10 next Sunday morning, where Paul is going to continue to warn against idolatry. If you did not get material that has today's lesson on one side and next week's material on the other, they should be back there in the back on the visitors table in the foyer. Thank you for being here.